going to Jackson. Gonna mess around. Yeah, I'm going to Jackson.
Hello!
Jackson.
Let me stop this music. That is Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash singing Jackson, live at Folsom Prison in sometime, like 1960-something or 1970-something. But we'll talk about Johnny Cash and prison rights and things in the 1960s when we get there. But for right now, let's talk about Jackson, President Andrew Jackson. Okay, we left off in case you missed it, just a little bit short of the end of the study guide, and I wanted to polish the last part of it off by talking about President Jackson. Okay, so if you're in the study guide, we are down here where it starts with the kitchen cabinet. I'll give you a moment to flip the pages to there. By the way, coming to you live from my classroom. Here I am. I'm at work. It's first period, waiting for second period to come on in here in a minute. And we're going to talk about Texas in class today. But it's Halloween as well. Happy Halloween. Let's talk about President Jackson. Deeply rooted in the Jacksonian notion of the presidency is this representation of the common man. Jackson believes that the American presidents up until now had been more elite, aloof, disconnected from the common man of the United States, and it was time for someone to take the leadership position and use the position as a way of representing the issues that were most near and dear to the hearts of the men of the soil of America, and that's going to be the Jacksonian message. The kitchen cabinet. A loose group of Jacksonian supporters who sat around the kitchen table and chatted about state affairs. These are mostly good friends from Tennessee who are helping Jackson in the transition from Tennessee politics to the big world of Washington, D.C. politics. Lawyers, journalists, business people, politicians, a good group of guys. The spoils system. The idea that the president should be able to appoint federal employees to people who are supportive of him and who have helped him gain election in order to reward their loyalty and to make the government function as they wanted to make it function. The spoils system allows Jackson to bring in about 1,000 federal employees. Comparatively speaking, his predecessors had replaced nowhere near that many. John Quincy Adams replaced 2. Okay, so 939 for Jackson. That's a lot. Flipping the page. How did Jackson handle the nullification crisis in South Carolina? Now, South Carolina nullifies or overturns the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832, claiming that they were abominations, bad. Okay, the tariffs unfairly rose the prices on American manufacturers, or protected those prices, I should say, while at the same time not protecting Southern goods. And the South Carolinian folk didn't like it. So Jackson got Congress to pass an act called the Force Act, which allowed them to collect the tariffs offshore. And in the long run, the tariffs are going to be lowered. And so there's no real confrontation or crisis here, but it looked close for a bit. Because think about it. If South Carolina can nullify a tariff, if they can simply say, no, we don't like that law, and we're not going to follow it, that has ramifications down the road. It allows other states to do the same with the tariff, or perhaps with other important pieces of legislation. This could get dicey, and it will get dicey when South Carolina and other states start leaving the Union in 1860 and 1861, and that's going to be an issue President Lincoln will have to deal with. Why did he want to kill the second bank of the United States, and how did he do it? He wants to kill the bank because it's full of fuddy-duddies. It's full of Northeastern, probably tennis playing, collar popped up, Jaguar driving, drink swilling, Richie Riches. Okay, guys of the Northeast who manipulate the U.S. economy by controlling the second bank of the United States and hurt the common man. And Jackson believes that the bank should go away. In 1832, he lets the people know that if he wins the presidency, which he's probably going to win anyway, that he will use that victory as a way of getting rid of the Bank of the United States. It's a 2-for-1 deal, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. And by winning the election that year, Jackson then begins his war on the bank. The most easy way to do this is to take the deposits of the bank and remove them and push them into state banks. A lot of people felt that Jackson was beginning to act a little bit beyond the powers of the presidency. More on that later. What reasons were given to explain why the Native Americans were moved? The Native Americans were on land that Jackson thought was far too profitable, far too valuable, and far too good, really, for Native Americans to live on and not use efficiently. That land should be there for the white farmers, the yeomen of the South that Jackson wanted to settle there, and that's why they need to be pushed. By the Indian Removal Act of 1830, Jackson obtained the right to move the Native Americans to the territories of Oklahoma and a little bit of Kansas as well. Native Americans, or part of the tribes, were promised land and money in return for moving, although many of them resisted. Chief among these were the Cherokee, living in Georgia, who through a series of 2 cases attempt to assert their right not to move and assert to continue to live on their ancestral lands. Even though the Supreme Court recognized the fact that they were not part of the state of Georgia, and in a second case, Worcester versus Georgia, held up the fact that the Cherokee had a right to the land, Jackson still began their movement, and the Trail of Tears, or the movement of the Native Americans to the west, happens mostly under President Van Buren. Jackson's famous line, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let's see him enforce it," essentially says, I have an army, and you don't. And I'll do what I like, thank you very much. What were the political ideologies of Roger Taney? Taney is a member of the Kitchen Cabinet. He believes in Jacksonian notions like a stronger state government in certain cases, and also the rights to commerce and free trade instead of monopolies. Long after General Jackson has gone to his maker, Roger Taney is going to be sitting on the Supreme Court, issuing forward decisions for the common man. The steps taken to entrench the South in the slave system and hierarchy, you're going to see more of the gang labor system, essentially a driver or a master overseeing a huge group of slaves doing work to try and work as hard and efficiently as possible. We're also going to see the elite culture in the South use their power to assure that the lower classes are kept uneducated and kept obedient. Okay, they're going to force them to fence in their lands. They're going to force them to serve on militias, which are used in order to go and get escaped slaves. In other words, there's this obedience there that's really controlled by that elite culture of the South. What led Americans to settle in Texas? Land. Very profitable, fertile land in East Texas that's kind of a continuation of that black belt through the Deep South. It's a good opportunity to go there. Now, Mexico is eager to get people into that land because they've recently won their independence from Spain, and they're trying to settle what is their furthest northeastern territory. For us, it's kind of a settlement to the southwest. So it's a bit of expansionism possibly for the United States. The people who settled there were also able to bring their slaves, which was an exception from Mexican law, but they got massive land grants, like 340,000 acre land grants, and then they were able to sell that land or use that land. Why did the war begin? The war begins when Mexico begins to try and assert more authority over the American settlers. Whoa, a foreign country asserting authority over Americans, and the Americans began a revolution. Yeah, I think we've seen that one before. I think, yes, that has happened. Okay, the war leads to a free Texas and an independent Texas. An independent Texas that's going to try and get into a part of the United States. Now, adding another big slave state to the nation makes a lot of people very nervous, and so Texas is going to have to wait for that annexation for almost a decade. In the meantime, it's the Lone Star Republic, and depending on whether or not you ask Texas or Mexico, it's either a smaller country that's sort of the eastern part of Texas, or it is this whopping big thing that is larger than Texas is today. So, it depends on who you ask. Major ideas and leaders of the Whig party. Now, the Whigs are a natural response to Jackson. People who felt like President Jackson had started to take on too much power joined a party called the Whigs. Generally speaking, these are the elite men, the educated men of society who feel that Jackson has sort of watered down the American democracy and that government needs to be done by elites, not by the common man. The spoils system had allowed too many common folk into the ideas. Who's in the party? Big names: Daniel Webster, John Calhoun, Henry Clay, all opponents, at least for the time being, of Andrew Jackson, men who began to see Jackson as perhaps too much of a powerful president. Now, the Whigs also bring with them a really big social agenda. The Second Great Awakening and Benevolent Empire had triggered the temperance movement. It had also triggered this self-improvement movement, and the Whigs are deeply rooted in that. The Whigs see themselves as self-made men, hardworking, this generation educated. They're not old money is what I'm trying to say, but they're people who have a great deal of interest in the furthering of the economics of the United States, and they want to make sure that people who understand those things are in control so the country can move forward. In 1836, the Whigs tried to really sweep the election with what's kind of a trick. The Whigs controlled the House of Representatives, and in presidential elections where no one wins an electoral majority, the House of Representatives gets to make the final decision. So the Whigs ran a slate of candidates. Instead of putting just one man up against Martin Van Buren, they ran 3 people, hoping that they could divide the vote enough to assure no electoral majority and that the election would kick itself into the House of Representatives, where they would be allowed then to pick the president. It's a pretty good scheme. That's what had happened in 1824 when you had 4 big national guys running for the presidency and no one had won. And eventually John Quincy Adams comes out of that one ahead. But unfortunately for them, it waters down the voting to the point where Martin Van Buren wins just enough of the vote in enough states to win a pretty clear electoral majority, even though he doesn't win that much of a popular majority. His popular vote totals more like a 51% to 49%. Electorally, he wins by more of a margin. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the 4th part of this unit. Study hard. I hope you're enjoying these videos. I'm enjoying making them. This is a great class. I'm enjoying the year, guys. We're heading on to the holiday season, and I think for me, that's got to be the best time of the year, right? Take care, guys.